Please welcome to the stage, Dean Karen Yarhi-Milo.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Great to see a packed room. Great to see you all. Welcome to Columbia SIPA, the Institute of Global Politics. I'm Karen Yarhi-Milo. I'm the Dean of SIPA, the Adlai E. Stevenson Professor of International Relations and co-founder of the Institute of Global Politics. This morning, we're here to grapple with today's geopolitical power dynamics. We are in a much more fragmented moment in comparison to the post-Cold War order, obviously compared to the Cold War order. But what do the associated shifts that we see mean for international security? What do they mean for regional conflict? How should we think America navigate this complex landscape? And how do we manage great power rivalry while avoiding what my mentor, Robert Jervis, called misperception in international politics, so that we do not find ourselves sleepwalking into conflict? How do we restore trust? How do we regain credibility? What's the strategic foresight in American diplomacy? To answer these important questions, we will begin with a panel discussion featuring a remarkable slate of experts. And then we will move to an across the aisle conversation, bringing together two former US Secretaries of State, Hillary Rodham Clinton and Mike Pompeo. This will be their first public dialogue together on stage here at Columbia SIPA. Today's conversation is in every sense extraordinary. Our speakers have served at moments of profound change in the international system and have confronted the hardest questions of statecraft: how to wield power responsibly, how to balance ideas with interest, how to make decisions under conditions of uncertainty when every choice carries both risks and consequence. Our Across the Aisle series rests on a simple but very powerful, in my opinion, premise which is core to SIPA's and IGP's mission. And that is that good policy depends on good disagreement. Democracy, diplomacy, and intellectual progress all require the ability to sit across from someone who sees the world differently and still engage. Engage curiously, engage respectfully, and engage creatively. Civil disagreement is not weakness. It is the foundation of democratic strength. When it's done well, it sharpens ideas, it reveals blind spots, and forces us to think beyond our assumptions. That is what we seek to model here at SIPA, an environment where people can argue passionately without losing sight of shared purpose. And we also seek to model and underscore the necessity of retrospection. The humility to look back and ask what we might have done differently. On Monday of this week, in a conversation about the Middle East, one of the architects of the Oslo Accords reflected candidly on the mistakes made along the way. And he said, if we were to do it all over again, we would do it differently. And that kind of honesty about both vision, about failure, is what true leadership demands. Foreign policy, after all, is an exercise in judgment under pressure. It is about choices made in real time with imperfect, incomplete information, with high ratios of signals to noise, and in a world that rarely rewards caution and never offers certainty. So reflecting on those choices and learning from them across political lines is what allows us to do better next time. So the timing of this discussion, I think, could not be more critical. The post-Cold War order, once marked by American primacy and relative stability, is giving way to something far more fluid that I'm not sure we actually understand. It's fragmented, it's volatile. We are witnessing overlapping crises. We're seeing a grinding war in Ukraine, a Middle East that is in the midst of profound transformation. We see intensifying competition with China. We see growing alignment among the axis of resistance. And at home, we see deepening polarization that increasingly shapes and sometimes constrains the choices available to our leaders. So a lot going on, and we need good people, good experts to unpack those questions for us. And I'm eager to hear what our first panel of experts have to say about this moment, and I'm delighted to introduce them. First, we have Ambassador Toria Newland. She's SIPA's Shelby Com Davis Professor and Director of our International Fellows Program. She's a highly accomplished and experienced career diplomat, having served as the 24th Under-Secretary of State for Political Affairs, Acting Deputy Secretary of State, and more. We have Ambassador Martin Kimani. He's current CEO of the Africa Center. He's also an IGP Carnegie Distinguished Fellow with us. And he and the Africa Center and IGP has forged an exciting new partnership. He also served as the former representative of Kenya to the United Nations, and we're really, really excited that he's with us today. We have Dr. Julian Gerwitz, who we're thrilled to have with us, an IGP Senior Research Scholar focused on U.S.-China relations. Formerly, he was Senior Director for China and Taiwan Affairs at the White House National Security Council. And we have with us, for the first time, I think, at SIPA, Biana Godriga, CNN anchor and Senior Global Affairs Analyst, and she will moderate this panel. I'm a big fan, and I'm very excited to have Biana with us today. So thank you all for coming. To the panelists, please join me on stage. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Dean, for that introduction. And as she noted, we have a lot to discuss today. So I'm honored to be joined with the distinguished panel and to be with all of you here today. Let me begin with you, Ambassador Newland. For the past 3 decades, policymakers had assumed that the post-Cold War order anchored in the United States leadership and liberal democracy was stable. From your vantage point, what moment marked the beginning of its unraveling? And I do recall that you once wrote that Russia's 2014 intervention, quote, shattered any remaining illusions about Moscow's willingness to live by international law. So was that the marker, in your opinion?
Well, thanks, Biana, and it's great to be with everybody today, and it's great to have this bipartisan moment here at SIPA, which is very, very important. Certainly, you'll remember that the United States spent quite a bit of time, both with China and with Russia, including with our European allies, trying to offer them a knitted place into the order that we had established after the Cold War ended, everything from welcoming them into the WTO, creating the G8 of the G7, various other opportunities. And each of the, in Moscow's case, they largely spurned those overtures and, as you said, then decided to violate the UN Charter in the most egregious way by trying to bite off a piece of their neighbor, not once, but twice. In the Chinese case, as we are seeing, they welcome the opportunity to join the order and then are working hard to change it from the inside. So 2 different techniques. But if you ask me when I would identify the moment of things beginning to unravel, I really think it's when we go after our own alliances and when this edifice of shared security, prosperity, and potential for democratic governance that the U.S. has championed for 80 years becomes something that we no longer support ourselves, and when we are equally brutal, equally mercantile with our allies as we are with our adversaries, and in some cases now in this administration even more so. And that makes one of the fundamental strengths for the United States and a fundamental strength of the order, namely that we are all trying to work together for collective common good to the extent that we can, and when we don't agree, to find negotiated solutions through, it becomes very difficult. So when the US turns rogue on the system that it created, that's the beginning of the end, in my view, and I think it's bad for America.
Do you think that it's this administration's goal to work together for the common good?
Again, I think that we start with this notion that we have somehow been victimized more than we've benefited from the system that we built. The president says that in his inaugural address last January. It's something that I profoundly disagree with, and I think a lot of Americans would disagree with. The question is, when you turn on your longtime friends, when you make it harder for this global cooperation, does the average American end up better off? I don't think so, but we'll see what history will tell us.
Dr. Gwartz, you've argued and written in a foreign affairs essay titled "China Thinks America is Losing" that China does believe that the United States is a declining power, and it is incumbent upon Washington to show that Beijing is wrong. How would you say that the current administration is approaching that viewpoint, and what must they do, what must we do to prove China wrong?
Thanks so much. So when I wrote that essay, which was actually during the first Trump administration, I started where I often start in studying Chinese politics, which is, what does Beijing think are the sources of American strength? And there are a few things. First, they do think we have a powerful economy. And in particular, they envy our innovation base, our technology ecosystem, that real cutting edge of the American economy. And then second, as Toria was just saying, they look at our alliances and partnerships around the world, and they envy those. And candidly, they even feel the pressure from those relationships when we work with our allies. But when we don't do that, when we take steps that make it harder to work with allies or make it harder to have the world's cutting-edge technology ecosystem, Beijing begins to say, maybe our way of doing business, Beijing's way of doing business, where a state-directed economic model, not having formal alliances, but using various coercive levers and economic incentives to pull countries in its direction, maybe that alternative works. And candidly, this is at the heart of US-China competition today. My own view is that Beijing's assessment right now is that time is on its side. That if it continues its very dogged, very focused strategy, both domestically and internationally, over time, more power will flow to Beijing. The world will look to China in new ways, and this is, I think, quite worrying for American interests over the long term.
I'm going to get back to China in a moment, but I do want to bring Ambassador Kamani in, because we often frame Africa as terrain for other powers' competition, and you have suggested that it should instead be seen as a demographic and normative power. In fact, you describe it as a lab for new political forms. Can you talk about what that actually means?
Yeah, hi, Biana. Thank you. It's great being here. I'll just pick up perhaps to answer you from where Julian left off. What are the sources of American power? And I find, having been in government, you're usually in government lagging where your people are. You lag your economy. You are powerful in government because you have a powerful economy. And you have a powerful economy because you're productive. You're making things. You are innovating. Or you're also you're influential because your culture and its cultural forms are attractive and give you, spark people's imagination. So in that way, Africa, compared to the other poles that we're discussing today, the United States and China, really does have time on its side. One, because we have the youngest population in the world, the fastest growing population in a world that is aging, and youth is cool. The norms of what is attractive, what inspires the world, are more often than not created by young people. So that way, in terms of population, I think Africa's young citizens are going to change the world. They're going to change fashion. They're going to change norms in certain ways. They're going to change what is attractive. But at the same time, they are intensely impatient with the ways African states are responding to their aspirations. So they're going to apply a lot of pressure on states, and they're going to apply a lot of pressure on states that are very fiscally weak, that don't have any of the great powers to sort of be a patron in the way that used to be perhaps a few decades ago. And so I think there's going to be a sea change in African governance, and that is going to come through a lot of volatility, a lot of risk, a lot of crisis, but the end product, that end run, is going to be a vastly different Africa that is far more driven by youth dynamics than by the sort of sclerotic states that are there now. And I think in this way, that is what Africa's major impact on the world is going to be. But that first period of crisis to get to African states that are responsive to young Africans is going to take a lot of navigation.
Are we seeing the first signs and steps of that at both African states and institutions sort of redefining and their terms of engagement with global powers?
Well, last June in Kenya, there was a huge amount of demonstrations by young Kenyans that really took things to the brink in terms of how the government responded. And as somebody who'd been in the government for a long time, it really humbled me. Because one thing I realized is that the Gen Z, who I had thought were relatively apolitical, it turns out they're intensely political. It also turns out they've been intensely attentive this whole time. When I thought they were sort of, online doing social media, they were actually following our economy. And so we had this spectacle where 50,000 young Kenyans would turn up on X Live to discuss budget lines. I'd never seen anything like that. And it gave me the sense that we in government, we in the senior positions politically, really didn't know our young citizens well. And I'm willing to bet that this is the case for most governments on the continent.
They've formed on X to discuss budget lines?
Yes, yes. And they would have people say, why is this budget line so much bigger than it should be? And then it would be, it's clearly fraud. This is fraud that has been budgeted for by Parliament. And it was incredible. And they forced the president to withdraw a finance bill. They forced huge changes within government. And then a year later, because of some police brutality, they went back to the streets. And if you look at what's happening in Tanzania right now, it's the same demand by young Africans that are saying the old game is no longer fit for purpose.
That's incredible. Ambassador Newland, let's go back to the transatlantic alliance, specifically as it references the war in Ukraine and sort of the stress tests that it continues to be under as this war, sadly, is now approaching, I think its fourth year. We've seen concerns about what a second Trump term could mean for the alliance and for the United States support. It's at this point not as bad as some had predicted in terms of the president's relationships and commitments to at least continue to support Ukraine by providing and selling weapons through NATO countries. When you look at the burden sharing, though, specifically among European nations, and some of the debates, the diverging security priorities between countries closer to Russia's border and those that are further away from the fighting, how have you viewed the U.S. role in all of these, in all of the challenges and the debates?
Well, one single person did more for NATO burden sharing than anybody else, and it wasn't Joe Biden and it wasn't Donald Trump, it was Vladimir Putin. And, after decades of presidents of both parties pounding on Europeans to do at least 2%, if not more, it was the war in Ukraine that woke Europe up, and the vast majority of allies under Biden's term and now continuing under Trump's are doing more. I do have to say that I think Europe gets huge credit this year for not going under its bed covers when we decided that we would not go back to the Congress for more budget support for Ukraine or for more defense support for Ukraine, but instead pushed onto Europe the primary responsibility. And they have put forward huge vehicles to support Ukraine's budget, to buy 180 billion worth of weapons. They are looking finally at using Putin's frozen assets as collateral to help Ukraine, whether it's now or whether it's in the reconstruction phase. But this constant questioning of how much the U.S. is going to put into the game, I think has made it very hard, both for the Ukrainians, who we have to remember are not just fighting for their own freedom, they're fighting for the general principles of the UN Charter, as I said, that you can't just bite off another piece of country, and they've done it enormously well, but for the security of Europe and for the security of the world order. So I think the worry is this sort of gas breaks, and the fact that we do have, the United States has quite a bit of leverage that it could be using with Putin now, and not just questions about whether to sell Tomahawk weapons, but really breaking the oil dependency of Russia, really making sure that sanctions are enforced, all these kinds of things, breaking the deepening links between Russia and China, where China is now the complete back office on this war. It's not simply full up weapons. It is all the Lego pieces that make it possible for Russia to continue to fight. And we have it in our means to apply a lot more pressure. And you know, the argument against the Biden administration always was that we gave Ukraine enough to survive but not enough to win. I think the question now is, are the Europeans are doing their best to help Ukraine not only survive but have new options. I worry that we are doing even less than that, and we could be doing more.
What are some of your concerns as the winter months are approaching? We already know Russia's strategy, sadly, throughout this war, and that is to make life as difficult as possible, not only for their energy sector, but in utility sector, but also for, sadly, civilians. What are you worried about as the winter weather is just weeks away?
Well, as we go into this fourth winter, the Russians are getting better at making Ukraine cold and dark and hitting it where they can, and more sophisticated with different kinds of drone techniques. So are the Ukrainians able to keep pace in defense, and do they have enough money to do that, and do they have enough technical expertise? And you know, we always hope that it will be a less harsh winter. The last two have been, so the worry is that it could be a very, very cold one. But we also have to appreciate the fact that Russia is itself at one of its weakest points, and it will not be able to sustain this level of war economy forever, even though Putin has now torqued his entire country to support this war, and therefore himself needs it to continue for power reasons. So if there was a longer-term perspective, not simply of European support, but of U.S., European democratic support for Ukraine, I think it would be harder for Putin to say, I'm going to win any moment and maintain support internally.
It was interesting. I was speaking with Gary Kasparov last night, and he was talking about Russia's, the economic strains that this war has had on Russia's own budget, and the one portion of the budget that he's yet to touch is that directed towards propaganda. So it gives you a sense, to your point, of the narrative that he's hoping and desperate to continue to control at home domestically.
Absolutely, and he's incentivized and provided for Russia's Rust Belt by making them the centerpiece of the economy to fight this war. So what happens if he actually were willing to end it? And it's not just that he has to actually provide for his people the things that they've wanted, education and openness and economic opportunity beyond war. He's going to have, 1 million veterans and folks coming off the battlefield that he has to deal with who say, what was this all for?
And Dr. Gwertz, we heard from Ambassador Nuland China's role here and the fact that we still haven't seen the pressure applied to other countries, including European countries, but also even India in terms of reliance on Russian oil. When do you think, or do you think that it's possible we could see pressure finally put on China from this administration on that specific issue?
Well, it's critical that we understand, as Ambassador Nuland said, that Beijing and Moscow have this deep and sustained ideological, economic, military, political partnership. And that's not going anywhere, but what the United States can do is put more pressure on China to change the incentives that they experience. Because right now, they are basically able to do the trade, buy the energy, help the military, take those steps that are helping Russia in a significant way with minimal consequences. A strategy to put pressure on the Chinese firms that are doing that activity, either through export controls or through financial sanctions, is there. And it is something that toward the end of the Biden administration, as this began to become a very apparent issue, we took steps to do. My worry now is, President Trump and President Xi met in South Korea recently. In the run-up to that meeting, both sides put a number of new policies to put pressure on each other. American tariffs, American export controls. China introduced this rare earths global control that made the United States economy very nervous and understandably.
The global economy.
And the global economy very nervous. And again, understandably so, because this is about asserting the ability to turn on and off one of the core inputs to every major technology sector, from cars to cell phones. But in the temporary truce reached by President Trump and President Xi, my worry is that Beijing took from that meeting an impression, maybe not explicitly stated, but certainly an impression, that the United States was not going to take further measures of that type really for any reason. And that would include the kind of Russia-related actions that we're discussing and are urgently needed. But I worry very much that if the United States were to do what we should do and introduce some of those steps, Beijing would say, well, then we're back off to the races with these rare earth controls. So it's not a great situation to be in, given how important it is to increase that pressure.
Right, and it's important to note the Trump administration, at least in its first term, really set the stage for the trade war, the technology decoupling, the shift from engagement towards competition. That was picked up, the dynamic, by the Biden administration. And you talk about exports control and technology restrictions. What do you make of this sudden shift now, where this is more of a commercially based detente, and the president seems to be more concerned about TikTok than some of the policies his own administration initially implemented during the first term?
It's an important question, and I think it's really critical to underscore that the American policy shift on China is, in many ways, a legacy, as you said, of President Trump's first term. Clarity about the challenge that Beijing poses, urgency to introduce economic measures to help protect our economy and also to increase pressure on China. This was something that later in the Obama administration folks began to see, but that they really acted with in an extraordinary way. But throughout that first term, there were always two impulses. There was always that impulse to take the national security and economic security threats of China seriously and to do a trade deal, as in fact they did at the end of 2019 and right in the beginning of 2020. That was, of course, disrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic, when we really saw them introduce a lot of measures. So to my mind, what we see now is that impulse to make a deal that has always been there and is, of course, central to the president's self-conception. That impulse is clearly driving the ship, but the national security challenges have not gone away. And to my mind, it's only a matter of time before we see a swing back in that direction, because again, Beijing is continuing the activities that created those problems to begin with.
And Ambassador Kimani, we know many African nations are struggling now with heavy debt burdens and competing infrastructure offers. This is where China has stepped in for so many years, and especially now in a second Trump term, trying to set itself as the stable force and competing force. Do you think by President Xi showing the world that he could at least threaten to withhold rare earths the way he did, was that a step too far?
Well, Bianna, if you don't mind me just coming in on this Euro-Atlantic, the Ukraine situation, because there are stakes there for the whole world. Just to make very quick points, the instruments that have been, the weapons especially, that have been so central to destabilization and warfare have been artillery, the Toyota pickup truck, and the AK-47. And one of the things happening in this war in Ukraine is the rise of drone warfare. And you can see drone warfare rising in sophistication much faster than defenses against drones. And it's a cheap form of warfare compared to all the rest, especially conventional weapons. And in Africa and elsewhere, drone warfare is becoming more and more influential. It allows a force that has been almost defeated militarily, but still can access drones, especially from an external actor, to again tip the balance of power on the battlefield. So I think the Ukraine war is going to affect the world also because of how it's being fought and what is being used in fighting it. The other thing about this war is how much attention it sucks from the United States and from Europeans. One, for the Europeans, they've encountered this war and found that they had much less autonomy than they perhaps might have imagined that they did. And I think this sort of shock to their political system has made them far less engaged globally. So today, if a European state talks peace building or peace mediation in Africa, they no longer have the sort of perch that they used to have. They're much easier to ignore. But also they're much less engaged. So in Africa, we are having a rise of new powers, external powers from the Middle East who are asserting themselves in Africa. And this is all part of the effect of the war in Ukraine. So as I watch the war in Ukraine and the extent of demand it makes militarily, financially, and politically on Western countries, it makes me believe that they're going to be far less able to maneuver strategically in places such as Africa. And that is not the case for China. China continues to engage quite robustly across the board in Africa. So whatever strategies are being played, rare earths or not, China, I think, is ascendant because it has more bandwidth and is more embracing of Africa, while the West has all its attention sucked away from us.
And sucked away from us, whether it's the war in Ukraine, Gaza, and sadly, very little attention on the ongoing war and genocide in Sudan. And I'm wondering, and feel free, all of you, to weigh in on this as to why the ball was dropped on Sudan. And for as long as this war has been going on now, every expert I speak to, I mean, I would say the media is also to blame given not covering this nearly enough. But the amount of attention that experts have been trying to divert towards this situation with the United Nations, with Quad members, why did we let this happen globally? Whoever wants to pick this up, please do.
Let me pick that up. We've been running a Sudan program at the Africa Center. I am not an uncritical fan of American foreign policy. I've had profound problems with how it has been conducted over the years. But today, there's something different about it. There used to be a phone call you could make to Washington when certain situations got out of hand. And usually you would find an official who is informed about the issue, is engaged to a certain extent, and you could work off that relationship to sometimes resolve issues. Now, the war in Sudan, let's not even call it a war, it's just a series of massacres of civilians, really shows the United States at a low ebb when it comes to actually engaging in, not just in Africa, but to prevent mass atrocity. Because you could say Africa is low down on the priority list, that's fine. But to not respond to this completely egregious war is really a signal that Washington not only has deprioritized Africa, but has deprioritized taking action against mass atrocity. And that creates a different global environment because the United States, more often than not, except for situations such as Rwanda in '94, the United States has often tried to step in when certain level of mass atrocity and human rights abuses happen. But that appears to be off the table. I hope it's not for the rest of the Trump administration, but that's what Sudan indicates.
I think it's actually worse than that, Martin, if I may, in the sense that we're not even engaged. It took the Biden administration a long time to pay attention to Sudan, but at the end began with a special envoy and all of these kinds of things. Sudan's a proxy war now, and in terms of the outside actors who are contributing to this war, the U.S. has lots of influence with all of them that it is not using. And here we are in Africa talking about things like the rights of Christians in Nigeria, important point, but not existential, the rights of Afrikaners in South Africa, while not only do we have this bleeding genocide in Sudan, we have the terrorist group JNIM bearing down in Mali on Bamako. We have this question of electoral rights in Tanzania, et cetera. We have a South Africa that should be booming with our support, and we're not going to the G20. So what I worry about in all of this is not just withdrawing support for and partnership with our traditional allies and everybody else, but that this very mercantile, selfish approach is leaching U.S. leadership from vast swaths of the planet where we used to be very active. This Africa example is only one, but we have similar situations in parts of Latin America, et cetera, where we're either nobody's in charge or we're focused on the wrong thing, and we're missing opportunities to really shape peace, security, prosperity, not just for many, many more people, but for ourselves.
Let me ask you about the Southern Hemisphere. You just mentioned Latin America. The United States announcing the deployment of the aircraft carrier USS Gerald Ford to South America. This is the largest U.S. naval presence that we've had in the region now in decades. We have about 8 warships, I believe, there. The Pentagon's confirming this and stating that it would, quote, help disrupt narcotics trafficking and degrade and dismantle transnational criminal organizations. Does this, to you, Ambassador Nuland, suggest a new pivot to the Southern Hemisphere? Is this a new approach to the war on drugs? Because if it's fentanyl, that's not the right location to be targeting. And are we instead going to, in the weeks and months to come, be focusing more on regime change?
I mean, this is the question. We were just with my class talking with Secretary Pompeo about what the intent of moving this aircraft carrier into the region is, and the fact that neither President Trump nor anybody else in the administration has really been clear about the goals. And then we have information about leaked CIA activity, which, anybody who's worked with the CIA, it's certainly not going to be effective if it's leaked. And then
the UK has stopped sharing intelligence
because they're not sure how we will use it
legally, right?
Exactly. So, Maduro is a bad dude, and the Venezuelan people deserve better. Is putting a massive aircraft carrier, and please, somebody in the press needs to tote up the cost of all of this when you deploy an aircraft carrier. It's like a nuclear weapon against fleas at the moment.
And the number of troops.
And number of troops and the accompanying ships and all of those assets that can't be elsewhere, et cetera, including in Asia, watching what China is up to. But we don't know what he's trying to do. Is he trying to get the Venezuelan military to coup? Is he trying to get Maduro to give up? Is he actually planning an invasion? And if so, to what end? Again, we talk a lot in my class at Columbia about, you can decapitate leadership, but if you don't build something better, then it's not clear. But any military officer, anybody who's done counter-narcotics will tell you that if you're really looking to interdict drugs, there are far more efficient, smaller, cheaper ways to do this, including working with local partners in territorial waters and working on those small aircraft that come in and the U.S. demand issue. So it's just not clear what's happening here. So again, we're throwing power around, but for unclear purpose, and missing opportunities where we actually could have a profound impact in our own interest, and we're choosing not to do it. So I worry about us hurting ourselves as much as anybody else.
And I can't imagine it's actually weakening Maduro, at least at this point.
There's some evidence in the polling that it's actually rallying a sense of patriotism in Venezuela, which has been sorely lacking because, nobody likes to be invaded, right?
Right. Dr. Goertz?
Yeah, if I may, I just wanted to come in on one key point that connects this to the China element as well. From Beijing's perspective, they have been watching very closely the question of whether the Trump administration believes that its primary goals should be a sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere that would permit President Putin to have a sphere of influence in his near abroad, and that President Xi to have the sphere of influence that he desires in East Asia. And I think they are looking at this moment as a key test of that. It's not to say that we don't have enormous challenges in our own hemisphere, but we have to send a signal to Beijing that we are in the region for good, that we are going to continue to keep forces positioned in the region to deter Beijing's most worrying ambitions. And currently, the signal of pulling ships out of the region to send them elsewhere, including to our own hemisphere, is confirming Beijing's suspicion, hey, maybe this is a situation where we're going to get the sphere of influence in Asia that we seek.
Right, and Ambassador Kamani, I mean, this is a development that would not only alarm our allies, but can be viewed as an opportunity for adversaries as well, diverting so much attention to an area. Yes, fighting drugs and crime and the border was one of the issues that President Trump was elected on. I don't think anyone had said that regime change in Venezuela or focusing so heavily on Venezuela and perhaps even encroaching on neighboring Colombia was what American voters had in mind.
Well, the United States hasn't been good at regime change in the past. The attempts at regime change have all really led to a great deal of damage. So I do not think that this is going to be any better, and I think would be significantly worse. And so that's not to defend the Maduro regime, which has problems, but it's to really, it's America beginning to behave like the other powers, which is maybe that's the way that would be a more normal America, that behaves like a great power, like the other great powers that think only of their own interests and don't think of the interests of other countries, other regions. But that would be a pity, because the establishment of these zones of influence, because the zones of influence always sounds very gentle, but it's a very violent process. You know, when you ask many people in the world, what was the Cold War to you? The Cold War to us was a hot war, was a series of hot wars and millions of people dying as the Soviets and the Americans contended against each other. So the attempt to establish zones that you police, where you dictate what happens in those zones, essentially attempts to flatten the politics, attempts to flatten the ambitions of those regions. And I think it creates a lot of instability for the countries within the zones. So I am looking forward really to a more balanced multipolar system. But the creation of that balanced and lawful multipolarity, I do not see it coming anytime soon. So in the meantime, the Africans, I think, are going to have to contend with becoming far more independent-minded, going to have to stretch to build their own instruments of continental peace and security, and try and do that while middle powers and others are trying to pick at all kinds of cracks within Africa. So it's going to be a tremendously difficult time. But since I see we've run out of time, let me finish with the first thing which I said, which is I don't want especially young Africans and young people in general to hear what I'm saying and think it's all doom and gloom. It essentially is the end of an era of people such as myself. And there's a huge vacuum waiting for inspired young people to reimagine these institutions and these way of doing things. Because frankly speaking, the present crop of people in power have run out of imagination. They're just playing the same old game again and again. We need a shift in paradigm.
All right, we have a minute and a half left, and I will keep us to time. I do want to ask Ambassador Nuland, we in the media have started playing this game with President Trump in this administration as to how much credit he does deserve, and will someone from the opposing party give him that credit? I know Secretary Clinton's been asked this question many times as it relates to the war in Gaza. I do have to say, though, that off the record, behind closed doors, in numerous conversations with European leaders and members of NATO, they have given President Trump credit for, as Putin is also given credit, unfortunately, for invading Ukraine, but for reawakening NATO and making NATO companies face the reality of needing to step up and provide more in their own security and defense. Do you think that credit is warranted?
No, I give that credit to the brutal Vladimir Putin, and it was well in happening before that. The concern I have is that the U.S., working with Europe and contributing, could be in a position to push Putin to understand that this war needs to end, and that we are not doing that.
We can all say amen to that. This war does need to end ASAP. I do want to thank the panel for the time. Thank you. It's wonderful being with you today. We have a wonderful discussion coming up next. I want to invite the Dean back for the introduction.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's okay. Toria, Martin, Julian, Bianna, thank you so much for that remarkable conversation. I am now pleased and honored to welcome Colombia's acting president, Claire Shipman. President Shipman is not only a distinguished journalist and best-selling author, she's also a proud Columbia College and SIPA alumna and served for many, many years on Columbia's boards of trustees, including as its co-chair. Claire, thank you so much for your leadership and everything that you've been doing for Columbia and for your support of IGP from its inception. Please join me in welcoming Acting President Claire Shipman to the stage.
I've had the good luck of spending a lot of time with SIPA and IGP lately. It's wonderful. And it is my great pleasure to introduce our next panel in this wonderful event, the Geopolitical Chessboard. Secretary Pompeo, of course, served as the 70th Secretary of State from 2018 to 2021. One of the many, many highlights of his tenure was the signing of the Abraham Accords. Secretary Pompeo is also director of the CIA. He was elected to 4 terms in the U.S. Congress, representing the 4th District of Kansas, so he's a fellow Midwesterner as an Ohioan. I appreciate that. He's also impressively a graduate of West Point who served as a cavalry officer in the U.S. Army. After leaving the military, he went on to graduate from Harvard Law School, and before running for office, he led 2 manufacturing businesses in South Central Kansas, in the aerospace industry, and then in the energy drilling and production equipment industry. We've been so lucky to have him as a member of our community since last February when he joined us as a Carnegie Distinguished Fellow through the IGP, and he's brought an enormous amount to this institution. He is joined by Secretary Clinton, who served, of course, as the 67th Secretary of State, a U.S. Senator from New York, and First Lady. Her many accomplishments as Secretary of State include managing the nation's relationships during the Arab Spring and during the global financial crisis, imposing sanctions on Iran, and advocating for the rights of women and girls around the world. She is now an incredibly dedicated and hands-on professor of international and public affairs, co-teaching one of our most popular classes. She's also the IGP co-founder and faculty advisory board chair here at SIPA. The 2 former secretaries are joining us in conversation with our truly exceptional and innovative dean, Karen Yarhi-Milo, for an across-the-aisle discussion of geopolitical power dynamics. The event series was created to bring together experts with different backgrounds and different perspectives to model respectful dialogue, but also critically to demonstrate that listening to and incorporating a wide variety of views actually moves us forward on real solutions to difficult global problems. This is an essential part of the work we do at Columbia. We're lucky to be able to watch it up close in the hands of such an august group. And so without further ado, I'd like to get us started. Let's thank all the participants. Thank you.
Oh, you're going this way, yes. Okay. Thank you. All right. Great to be with you. Great to be with you. I mean, this is a very special moment at IGP. I'm glad that we are here. Glad that we're doing this. We should start by saying that both of you teach this semester. Secretary Clinton has been teaching now for the 3rd year. A class that we co-teach together inside the Situation Room, which is about the theory and practice of crisis decision-making. We have students in the room from our class? Yes, yes. And Secretary Pompeo, you want to say a few words about what you're teaching this semester?
I taught a course in short-term crisis management. We took North Korea as the center point, and we had a lovely time. It was a course for about 12, 13 students. It was great. I learned a lot.
Wonderful. So there's a lot that I want to cover with both of you today. Let's start with you, Secretary Pompeo. Let's begin at the 30,000 feet. The geopolitical chessboard today looks nothing like it did even a decade ago. It's not just about states and armies. Now it's about chips. It's about AI, supply chains, information warfare, and great power rivalries. We see realists are telling us that multipolarity invites instability. Technologists warn us that AI will reshape war and peace. And given your experience, how should diplomats sift through the noise between what's urgent, what's merely loud, to make right the kind of threat assessments that we should be making at this moment? And what are the policymakers getting right today, and what do you think they're not getting right today?
Oh goodness, that's hours worth there.
Yeah, and you have a minute.
Exactly. First of all, thank you for having me here, Secretary Clinton. It's wonderful to be with you, and thank you all for joining us today. Look, maybe I'll just cut to the chase. I think you got a core piece of this right. I think the world has evolved, certainly even since my time, since Secretary Clinton's time, who was there during the great financial crisis. Most of this conflict today is economic. So big militaries matter. The capacity to deter aggression absolutely matters. What people are fighting for is resources and economies, and what the global infrastructure will look like for the next 75 years. So we've been riding on the post-World War II order for about that long, and so much has changed from an economic and technology standpoint. And so what the United States ought to be thinking about, its diplomats ought to be thinking about, is how do we position our nation to lead the world? Because without U.S. leadership, the world is a really, really scary place. There's no substitute. There's no number two. That's not American arrogance. That's just my experience set. And second, how do we do that in the context of making sure that the next billion people can be fed, and that the world commercial infrastructure, economic infrastructure, turns to a Western model, one that is dominated by people with ideas of human dignity, basic property rights, contract, all of these things that have benefited the United States so much. How is it that we position ourselves in a way that the next 75 years still look like American global leadership? That's a short answer to a very complicated question.
Secretary Clinton.
Well, I agree with Mike. There is no short answer, but we'll do our very best. Of course, the changing nature of the economy, driven largely, not exclusively, but largely by changes in technology we have yet to even fully understand, let alone grasp the impact that AI will have. All of that has to be looked at in the context of how the world will shape itself and what role the United States should play, because I also agree that if the United States leaves a vacuum, if the United States retreats to a kind of, as we heard in the first panel, great power sphere of influence model, that makes, I believe, both our security and our economic interests far less stable and much more likely to be less in our own control. What do I mean by that? Look, the economy and technology have changed. I'm not sure human nature has. That may happen because of the way that our brains are being literally rewired because of the technology we are using and even addicted to. So that may be something that we have to, maybe reconsider in the future. But if you look at the competition currently occurring between and among China, Russia, the United States, a few other aggressive actors. Iran is on its back foot. I'm not sure it'll stay there. It's going to do its very best to get off of it and try to reconstitute its Shiite axis as well as its nuclear program. North Korea remains a very difficult nation to predict its actions. Whatever India decides to do in the midst of its own development. We have a lot of other players on this board, and the lesson I took from the first panel is that right now the United States is in retreat, has left the chessboard to others to make the major plays, is not even really as interested as I wish it were in trying to respond, as Martin mentioned, when calls come in, let alone manage some of the challenges. So there are a lot of other developments that need to be factored in, and I think Africa is a critically important part of that analysis, because if you listen to what Martin said, there's going to be a lot of turmoil, conflict, uncertainty in Africa, both coming from within, as young people rightly seek their own autonomy for their own futures. I remember being in Nairobi about, 10 or 15 years ago and meeting with a group of students at the university. And as you entered into the university campus, there was a big sign saying you are entering a no corruption zone, because what they wanted was the kind of rule of law and standard of norms and enforcement and accountability that would give them all a better chance than they might otherwise have in a more corrupt regime. You have the reconstitution of jihadist elements in the West and Sahel. You have the unbelievably brutal conflict in Sudan. You see South Sudan about ready to explode. So we ignore Africa at our peril, let alone missing the opportunity to perhaps, help mediate or end some of that challenge. So it's a very unstable situation, and there are factors like technology that are going to affect everybody. But with the United States adopting a more hands-off attitude toward much of the world, I think that we lose the leverage that we could be using.
Yeah, so let me take this concept of how the United States should lead, and part of it is issue of think about credibility and the issue of Americans' role. Credibility is the currency of diplomacy. Many argue, and I wonder, Secretary Pompeo, if you agree, that America's credibility has suffered in recent years. We have abrupt policy reversal to shifting alliances, inconsistent aid policies, and so on. Do you think the United States has a credibility? Do you think the United States have a credibility problem? And if so, what concrete steps you would want to see the United States, or you would recommend that this administration take to restore trust and credibility around the world? And where do you think there is more or less of an issue there?
Yeah, your question kind of begs like treating the last 9 months as the beginning of America. Yeah. Right? And it's like, oh my gosh, we lost all of our credibility in just 9 months. How did we squander it so quickly? No, that's not my observation. Yep. I actually think I think the world is fundamentally different. That I still think, and I could give you anecdote after anecdote. I still think the world turns to the United States whenever there's real trouble, and I would argue that the Gulf Arab states find this administration far more credible than they did the Biden administration, for good or for bad, rightly or wrongly. Mm-hmm. Right, when the Iranians threatened in the first administration, we took out Qasem Soleimani and restored deterrence. We didn't have the attack into Gaza on the first Trump administration's watch. It's just a factual statement. One can argue about why and all of that. American credibility matters an awful lot. And from my perspective, what that really means is being very clear about what your end objectives are and not talking about the things you won't do. I think when you talk about there are things we're simply not going to do, you invite our adversaries, the very folks that Secretary Clinton spoke about, they think it's go time. And for all the things that we can spend time on the great chessboard, the central challenge is singular. It is from the Chinese Communist Party under Xi Jinping. The only one. By the way, I met with the Taliban. They're bad. Met with Chairman Kim, not someone you want running your Boy Scout troop, so I get it. But the truth is, the only one that can change the way our children and grandchildren actually live resides in Beijing and in Xi Jinping. By the way, I'm very careful. It's not China. It is the Chinese Communist Party under Xi as he currently thinks about his effort for global hegemony. And that's the confrontation. That's the place we have to be most credible. We need to drag, you mentioned the Indians. We need what I'll call all the folks who believe in Western civilization, and they'll all have different takes. They're not all going to be democracies. But all the folks who believe in sort of these core ideas and are trying their best to get there, we need them on team Western civilization, and the United States needs to lead that. And when we do, we will have put out a credible strategic overlay against which we can make all these, I'll call them semi-strategic, operational, tactical decisions about how they should manifest themselves in any particular situation. The last thing I'll say is we should be unambiguous, and this gets to American credibility. We shouldn't use the word competition and the Chinese Communist Party in the same sentence. This is not a competition. We compete with Ireland. Right? California competes with Nebraska. The Chinese Communist Party wants to cut our heads off. They killed 10 million people and didn't lose a moment's sleep when a virus was foisted around the world. That's just true. It wasn't an effort, they wasn't a weapon, but they didn't do a single thing to save a single one of your lives or anybody else's life around the world. And Xi Jinping was untroubled by that. I think that tells you about the difference in nature between what I'll call the people who believe in the ideas and our values in Western civilization and that leadership there in China today. And that's where we should focus, how we should think about it. And that's where it's most important that America is credible on every front, economic, military, and diplomatic as well.
Secretary Kalina?
Well, I do think that China poses a continuing and serious threat. But I don't think that that's the only threat we face. And in fact, I think we embolden China and send them messages that they then pocket about our willingness to stand up to them because of our failure to stand up to others. Now, I think the war in Ukraine is a proxy for everything that we believe in and care about. And the retreat from helping Ukraine defend itself against Russia sends a message not just to Vladimir Putin, but also to President Xi in Beijing. If you think about the sequencing, right before Russia invaded Ukraine, he went to Beijing because the relationship there now is much more of an unbalanced one. You know, China holds the upper hand. So Putin went to Beijing and, from what we're told, basically, confirmed to Xi that they were going into Ukraine. They would take over Ukraine in a week. They would depose the democratically elected government, and they would be back in the business of expanding the Russian Empire. So Xi goes, well, that's going to be interesting to watch. It did not happen. And what is one of the things that we have seen as a result, and Julian's an expert on this, is massive purges of the Chinese military. All kinds of investigations of Chinese military officials, in part because of corruption, but also because she's looking at the vaunted huge Russian military, which has now suffered more than 100 casualties, dead and injured, and they're not yet, thank God, in Kyiv, and they're not yet controlling Ukraine. So I think that on this chessboard, there are a lot of players who are making moves. It's not just a two-party game where it's China sitting across from the United States and, we move our knights and they move, their bishops and we figure out how it's going to happen. You've got the Russian influence. You've got all kinds of alliances that we used to invest a lot in that can send messages to China not to think about what they are doing in the South China Sea or what they might do in Taiwan. But if we are not there to support and stand up for our own alliances vis-a-vis China, then you give a free hand to Xi to intimidate and coerce using both hard and soft power. So I certainly agree with Mike that the ultimate contest may very well be whether our form of government and economic choices is able to withstand, the Chinese command and control economy and everything else. But there are a lot of other players on this, global chessboard. And I just want to add one other thing, because again, it came up in the first panel, and I do worry that inside the Pentagon right now, from what I hear, there is an internal discussion happening about what the national security strategy of the United States will be. And there seems to be a group within the Pentagon who are advocating for these spheres of influence. And now, what does that really mean? It means, okay, United States, you've got the Western Hemisphere. Okay, Putin, you've got Russia and the near abroad, and you can intimidate Europe. Okay, China, you've got most of East Asia, and you can control the navigable waters of the South China Sea, through which about 50% of maritime traffic passes. I think that's a disaster. And I think it weakens us vis-a-vis our principal problem, which is, are we, or is the Chinese Communist Party model going to succeed in the 21st century? So I agree that we've got to keep our eye focused, but I think our peripheral vision also has to be highly attuned to everything else going on that will influence people's response to what they see happening in China. And I think we are shrinking our influence because of how we are both acting and the messages that we're sending. And I don't say this as just a Trump administration problem, although I think it's much more extreme under this administration. I think American reaction to the last 25, 30 years has been quite complicated and mixed. In the press, in the public, what does it mean to defend Ukraine? And, do we want to really do that? Or how do we influence others? So I think it's a bigger issue, but I think that perhaps the Trump administration has taken the wrong lessons from, the questions that have been raised and given, inadequate answers about how we best assert our influence and our power.
Thank you. Mike, do you want to comment on the sphere of influence thesis? I'm hearing more
sure.
about it.
Happy to do that. No, I agree with almost everything Secretary Clinton said there.
Record
They
that.
record it.
Exactly.
I think there is a lot of people who are recording.
I'm sure that will flood Twitter today, or whatever, X, or whatever the heck it is. No, but I completely agree. I want American hegemony, and what I really mean by that is I want the American ideas. It's not about empire building. I want the American value set, the Western civilization value set, to dominate the world for the next 250 years. That's the objective, and I do agree. Places like Ukraine matter an awful lot. It's even. I think I would go. I'd like hold my beer on this one. Like, the Chinese are deeply involved in Ukraine today. They're providing most of the important materiel for the Chinese. There are 13,000 North Koreans on the ground inside of that conflict today. They did not go there without Xi Jinping asking Chairman Kim or directing Chairman Kim or some variation on that theme to go and be there, certainly with his approval. No, Xi Jinping's watching very closely how the West is responding to this challenge from Vladimir Putin. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I think that's absolutely essential. And as for spheres of influence, I want to influence every sphere. I want to influence, by the way, I would say the first Trump administration, we didn't do enough. I think previous administrations didn't either in Africa, to your point. I think it's hard, especially post 9/11, where we became very focused on counterterrorism, the entire national security apparatus. I think we did take our eye off the ball on some of these other issues. And we should certainly make sure we're doing this properly in the economic sphere. That if you said, where will most of this be contested, won or lost, it will be in the economic and technology sphere. And that is absolutely not an America issue. I am fine with semiconductors being made in Norway or the Baltics or in Korea. I do not want them made in Western China. I want them made in some place that we can have the capacity to deliver the outcomes that Western civilization will depend upon.
Okay, so let's see if we have another area where there's agreement or disagreement.
No, you may have run the table on that.
Maybe. Let's see. USAID and the issue and the role of development and foreign assistance. What do you think about what role it should play? Obviously, we see the dismantling of USAID, but what should be the architecture of aid? How should Washington modernize its aid strategy or compete in that sense, effectively with China, with the Gulf and others that are deploying their own development models?
You want to go first, Secretary?
Yeah, let's go with you first on this.
Well, I firmly believe that the United States has to have a strong defense, has to have a very effective, active diplomatic outreach, and we need to use development tools as part of our whole suite of national security and foreign policy goals. Both Mike and I, as Secretaries of State, had responsibility for USAID. And, when I was there, because of work I had done in the Senate and even before, wanted to make it more efficient, wanted to make sure we had greater impact. And in many areas, we actually saw that. Other areas needed, more reform or elimination. But there was an effort to try to utilize the tools of development, investing in, everything from disease surveillance to education programs and all in between. So I think it was an error. I think it was a unforced error to totally destroy USAID without regard to where we were getting our money's worth and where we could do a better job and where we shouldn't be active. And I think something will have to replace it, because let's just take disease surveillance. We don't have it right now. And we are living in a very complex biozone called the Earth. And we saw what happened with great cost coming out of China in 2019. The threat has not disappeared. And so part of what we need to be doing is being on the ground, not just watching and recording and surveilling, but cooperating as best we can and pushing countries that are uncooperative, like China turned out to be post Wuhan, in order to protect ourselves. Diseases don't respect global boundaries. And so that was one area that we had really not just provided a lot of information for ourselves, but really for the entire world. Weather, climate. I know in this administration, climate's not an appropriate word. Let's call it weather. We need to keep track of what's happening, again, because the biggest drivers of huge refugee flows are weather and conflict, and loss of economic opportunity, particularly with the connection to climate change. So I feel like we need to work on replacing or creating an alternative. And the final thing I would say is, the United States under President George W. Bush created PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Program to combat HIV/AIDS. It was an extraordinary success. And because it was a success, a disease that ravaged nations and populations within nations was held in abeyance. And we really saw a positive impact in many parts of the world and also here in the United States. That was an investment in American values as well as disease prevention and treatment. It wasn't building a soccer stadium, but it was saving lives. And the United States has a great story to tell about what we have done over the last 50 years, since, even longer, since John Kennedy created USAID, about how we used our soft power, how we used our development dollars. And I think we missed a big opportunity, and again, this is bipartisan failure, not to tell that story more effectively, so that when USAID was dismantled, a lot of Americans thought, well, what difference does it make? how did it affect my life? And it probably took 20% of the federal budget, which was, beyond an exaggeration. So I would like to see us figure out how we're going to use development tools to enhance our security and our interests around the world.
I guess, and I don't have much to add here other than you do face, when you occupy the roles that Secretary Clinton and I had, you often face institutions, sometimes they're American institutions, sometimes they're international institutions, that are, that their charter makes sense, but they are no longer as functional as they should have been, or could have been, maybe were, maybe not. But they ought to do better. And the question is, do you stick in there and try and reform them, or do you blow them up? And there's no straight line answer. USAID would have been the same place. I certainly found it as something that needed a massive amount of work to actually function, to your point, to deliver in a way that not only got good outcomes, but the American people understood, by the way, relatively how little money, to your point, but also its effectiveness, why it mattered to them. And that story hadn't been told. And I think USAID had become, to be polite, it had become much less effective, that's my best diplomatic link, much less effective than we all would hope it could have been. And so the question is, what do you do? So now the challenge is, much like it was with the World Health Organization. I mean, you think about this, right? We talk about the WHO, and everybody says, oh my gosh, we need to be in the World Health Organization. If you watch their behavior in the aftermath of the leak out of the Wuhan virus, it's evil. It's worse than incompetence. They sided with the Chinese Communist Party in the moment, the critical time. The most important thing that WHO was supposed to do was prevent precisely these kind of pandemics, and it failed in its core mission. Do you stay in it? It's an interesting, difficult, complex, probably fully unanswerable question. We chose, nope, we're going to go try and find another way to do it. I'll give you one more example. The World Intellectual Property Organization. Any of you actually ever heard of it? Yeah, anyway, I'll show of hands. Yeah, a few of you, probably IP lawyers. Makes you smarter than me. The World Intellectual Property Organization is controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, the singular entity that cares least about intellectual property and certainly the preservation of it on the global stage. Why on earth would I take an American taxpayer dollar and support the World Intellectual Property Organization? Do we need such a creature? We don't even all agree on what it should do. But yeah, you need a standard-setting organization that does this, but it shouldn't be something that works against American interests. And so this is the challenge. Do you go try and fix it by the UN, not far from where we're sitting today, I would argue is completely broken. Go look at its charter and then go look at what it does every day. I don't have an answer for its substitute, but it is no longer fit for purpose. The very idea that it emanated out of in the post-World War II order has now been abandoned by most of the leadership at the United Nations today. I wouldn't have said that 10 or 15 years ago. That is dangerous, not just for the United States, but for the world. It needs to return to its charter and do its job. And so, Mike, should we get out of the UN? It's an interesting question. We ought to think seriously about making sure that it is delivering on not what Mike would want it to do, or that you might want it to do, but what it says it's supposed to do. And it is, I'll give you one, here you go, here's a question for the group. Anybody call the UN when the conflict breaks out any place in the world? Is that the first place anybody thinks about, we're going to go solve this conflict by heading to the building just down the street? I would proffer to you that they don't. Instead, they actually come to Washington, D.C. and try and get America to step in and solve it. That's at odds with what it was supposed to be doing. It's no longer fit for purpose, and we all need to think hard about how to make it functional. And I would put USAID and other things like, let's go make them deliver against their intended mission and get good value, and then communicate like hell to the American people about why we should spend American money to support these things. Because I, as with you, think they do matter an awful lot. American soft power is absolutely critical to achieving our end objectives.
So let's shift a little bit to what's happening here in the United States, domestic polarization, because even the best crafted foreign policy can be constrained by domestic politics. And we see this, you have both divisions within your parties about US foreign policy, about the Middle East and other areas, Ukraine. How dangerous is the domestic polarization, this trend in America, for America's ability to act in a coherent way abroad? And is there still a foundation for bipartisan statecraft when it comes to those, big foreign policy challenges?
I'm happy to go first. We
Okay.
were both also elected officials. We both had to answer to the American people at one point in our lives.
Okay, you go first.
You had a big state in New York. I had little old South Central Kansas. I worry less about this than the media narrative. We've always been a rambunctious nation. It's literally since our founding, like they're killing each other. And yet we get excited today when somebody gets angry on CNN. Like, oh, okay. And are there lots of divided views inside the Republican Party on these issues on national security? Absolutely. By the way, it's not binary. It's not we've got isolationists and neocon globalist warmongers. Right? It is much more nuanced than that. And I would say the same thing about the Democrat, the other major party. I actually think that's wonderful. My actual hope, I'm not worried about the polarization. It's often how it's characterized. These are deeply important ideas. We should argue about these things. I'm worried about the fact that we're actually not arguing about them. I'm worried about the fact that we've got social influencers on TikTok that are shaping your minds and that's controlled by the Chinese Communist Party to a significant degree. That's dangerous. It's dangerous that rewarding the person who puts out the best meme or the candidate who's the most articulate and best looking. Those are dangerous things. Those aren't about these ideas that are central to our Judeo-Christian heritage. What really matters is that you, not me, not Secretary Clinton, we're formers, right? You all are the American voting public. You all have a responsibility. Stop them. Stop them. When a candidate for Attorney General in the state of Virginia advocates for the murder of his own constituents, you should not vote for that person. That's a bad idea, right? That's just a terrible. And he's now going to be the Attorney General for the state of Virginia. That tells you that our discourse has become unhinged and we're no longer crediting things that matter to us as a matter of character and virtue and decency. And this is not Republican, this is not Democrat, this is about who we are as Americans. So I worry less that your mayor thinks that we should have free grocery stores, government-run grocery stores. Okay, that's an idea. We should all debate it. We shouldn't mock it. We should just say, no, I think that's a bad idea because of X, or I think that's a brilliant idea because of Y. That's the discourse that the American people deserve, and I hope you will all demand that of everyone from every place along the political spectrum.
Thank you. Secretary Clinton.
Look, I think that we should have more debate. We need more dialogue, even like what we're doing here today. And I do think that the Congress has abdicated its responsibility. Both you and I served in the Congress to do either. You know, they're not holding hearings. They're not having thoughtful debates. They're not even regular order. They don't even go through the committee process anymore to debate something. And part of that, I will, suggest, is because the Republican Party you were part of no longer exists. And it is in total service to one man and whatever he says and whatever he does, no matter what an individual lawmaker's doubts or questions might be, is what happens. And I really regret that. I regret that deeply because I served for 8 years in the Senate. Some of the people I served with are still there. Their tongues must be totally bitten off because they don't speak out. They don't publicly, take positions that are contrary to whatever the administration's position is. I don't think that's healthy. We have issues, obviously, in the Democratic Party about whose voice is the loudest, who drowns out whatever debate there might be. But there is a lot more difference of opinion, whether you're happy about that or not, in the the range of people within the existing Democratic Party structure in the Congress and elsewhere. But I think we're missing a kind of larger concern, and you alluded to it. So much of our public discourse now is directed, and you could even say controlled by social media. And I think that's a huge danger to democracy. You and I are totally in agreement that we have allowed TikTok outside of China, because the TikTok inside of China is very different than the TikTok outside of China. we have allowed TikTok, which is, at the end of the day, found by a bipartisan decision in the Congress to be controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. At the end of the day, that's where the algorithms are going to be either, approved or disapproved. I mean, I'm not saying it's a daily, question, but it is clearly a mode of control. And we have allowed social media to be the source for where more than 50% of the people in this country get their news. And when Karen and I asked about that in our class, it was even more than 50% of really smart students, because we have really smart students in our class, get your news from social media. And when people speak up about maybe an unpopular issue, if they're in the Republican Party and they speak up about we should be arming Ukraine, we should be giving them air defense, they'll be piled on by voices, some of which are legitimate differences of opinion, and some are Russian bots and trolls and all kinds of shenanigans meant to drive that voice into a very tiny corner. In the Democratic Party, you say you're for or against the shutdown, well, you get totally overwhelmed by what's going on online. And one thing we did learn is that Russia plays in our domestic politics all the time. I think it was, somebody on the earlier panel, maybe Toria, who said, the Russian economy is largely being kept afloat because China's buying, fossil fuels. A few other customers are as well, because of a war economy. But at the end of the day, they have an extractive economy and a war economy. They don't have a vigorous prospect for growth and prosperity. But one thing they're really good at is propaganda. And the Chinese are playing more in that. To some extent, the Iranians were more before, recent times has, undermined, their capacity. So, it's hard for us to have the kind of honest, forthright agreements and disagreements that we need to have. There are good arguments for and against doing a lot of the things that are on the agenda for whether we are going to remain strong and prosperous and united and all the rest of it. But we're not having that. Some of it because of intimidation from this administration for their own party. Some of it because of social media and the like. So, I think polarization is certainly real, but it's not inevitable. But that requires every one of us to assert our own agency against being told what to believe, being told what we're supposed to do, or being influenced by voices on social media that you're not often even sure what's behind their position. So I think we have some serious challenges as to how we get back to the kind of give and take and organize, as well as just, citizen discussion that we need in a democracy. And that does really bother me.
Thank you. So I want to now move to talk about, this is about the geopolitical chessboard. So very quickly, take 4 minutes and go around the world and think about U.S. foreign policy in different regions and different issues that are coming up. So if I can get, quick reactions from both of you. Let's start with you, Secretary Clinton, on the on Western Hemisphere. Venezuela, what's the Trump administration has been doing? What do you think it is about and what is not about?
Look, I think that if you look at Venezuela, it's a bad regime. They have taken what was the richest country in South America and turned it into a basket case. They have forced millions and millions of their citizens to flee, both because of political repression and economic collapse. So you're not going to, I think, hear anybody who looks at the Maduro regime defending it, unless they have an ideological bias toward whatever it is he thinks he's doing there. And I think that what the Trump administration is doing is very questionable. Number one, if you're going after fentanyl, there is very little to no evidence Venezuela is a source of fentanyl. If you're going after drugs coming to the United States, the overwhelming assessment by the DEA and others who, when they can, speak independently, is that Venezuela is a pathway to Europe. We can want to stop drugs going to Europe. That's a perfectly good thing to do, but that's not the stated reason. If you are talking about the authority to do what they're doing, again, it goes back to a refusal even to go to the Congress to speak to the requisite committee chairs and leaders to provide some kind of justification other than they're drug traffickers and we're going to blow their little boats out of the water. So I think it's about regime change. I mean, you don't move an aircraft carrier to Venezuelan vicinity to get rid of fentanyl. This is about regime change. Is it because Maduro is such a bad guy and clearly is, corrupt and involved in some way in benefiting from the drug trade that goes on? Absolutely he is. But what is regime change, to go to a point that, was made earlier? We're not so good at regime change. And, if we're going to, bomb Venezuela, if we're going to put troops on the ground in Venezuela, what is the next act? I remember being in Iraq when, the statue toppled, Saddam Hussein was gone, and then for whatever reason, we had no plan. And in fact, we dissolved the two entities, the military and the Ba'ath Party, that had any kind of institutional capacity. We're not so good at this. So is it part of dominating the Western Hemisphere and the sphere of influence? Do we next move on to Colombia in the Pacific? I think there are a lot of very difficult questions that have yet to be answered.
Secretary Pompeo?
I'll try to be brief. It's interesting, that critique was that President Trump's been too aggressive and too much on the world stage, when the previous critique was that we've backed off the world stage. Interesting. Second, I do think President Trump is determined to defend American sovereignty, and we had a wide open southern border that included coming from places not just from Mexico, and he is trying to go right that ship. He believes that is deeply problematic for a nation. I concur with him. Illegal immigration is a tragedy for nations. They need to have the rule of law, and they need to enforce it with enormous vigor. And I couldn't tell you exactly what their end-stated objective for the Trump administration is in Venezuela. They haven't articulated it clearly. I suspect they will before too long. But it was the first Trump administration that indicted Maduro as a narco trafficker, something that no previous administration had chosen to do, in spite of the fact it was plainly obvious. And I think they are continuing to increase the pressure to give the Venezuelan people a real shot at a better life. And that is a decent thing, a good thing, and I have to be a little careful as a former CIA director when you talk about regime change. But make no mistake about it, it is important that we defend the basic values that we have, and the Venezuelan people don't have access to basic religious freedom, basic property rights, and decency, and we ought to do things that are within our power to effectuate that and make it better for them, even if we can't get them all the way to where we'd like them to be.
All right, so let's move now to the Middle East. This is a region we haven't had a chance to talk about today. We have the 20-point plan. We have the President Ashara in the White House, the Syrian leader. We see some escalation in the northern border, and we had the attack on Iran. Overall, Secretary Pompeo, how do you assess the situation right now in the Middle East? How do you think the United States should continue, or to what extent it should be involved, and in what way?
This is singular. This is about Tehran. Everything else is a sideshow. You got to go deal with it. You got to go figure it out. But everything's a sideshow. When I was a Secretary of State, there were many hands in the Abraham Accords. I take no credit for them. I was a small part of it. But there were three central theses. One, Israel good, friend, partner, ally, not going to break with them. We're with them, lock, stock, and barrel. They're a democracy. We want them to succeed. Second, Iran bad. It's kind of redneck foreign policy, right? Iran bad. No one disputed that. They were causing trouble in the region. And the third leg of this was, if we worked with our Gulf State Arab partners and convinced them that we would stand with them if the regime in Iran came for them, that we could develop an architecture to create a model which everybody recognized was the right model, right? The fundamental model was just to recognize the fundamental right of Israel to exist. The previous Secretary of State said you can't do anything in the Middle East until you solve the conflict with the Palestinians. We proved that to be false. So I say that as the predicate for where we find ourselves today. It is Hamas isn't going away quietly. Hezbollah is not going away quietly. These folks won't give up. They are resistance movements. They will continue to resist. Israel's going to do what it needs to do. It's not going to allow October 7th to happen again. They realize the folly of their ways. They're going to go provide for their own security, no matter what anybody else in the world guides them, tells them to do. And for the U.S., you can see President Trump is leaning in, trying to build on the success of getting the hostages back, an unambiguous good thing. Getting most of the bodies back. If I'm reading the papers correctly, we still don't even have phase 1 of this transaction complete. And trying to build out a model. The hinge point will be, can you find someone who's prepared to go in and do actual peacekeeping inside of Gaza? I think that's going to prove incredibly difficult. I hope that we collectively are successful at doing that. But nobody wants to go admit the hard thing, which is that Hamas still has weapons and capability and infrastructure. And so long as they do that, peacekeepers can't go in and wear blue helmets and walk around and act silly. They have to go there and be prepared to actually crush Hamas. And to date, the only ones that are demonstrated that they're actually willing to do that is the IDF with U.S. support. And I think that's the place we'll find ourselves still for a bit. I hope I'm wrong. I hope we can find folks who will go in there and do the necessary and stamp out extremism in Gaza. And if you can do that, you get a chance to rebuild and make life better for the people who live there in Gaza.
And on Iran, are you happy with the current state of affairs?
No, it shouldn't have been a 12-day exercise. We should have stayed at this. And I think what President Trump did was historic. I can't think of any other president that would have done that in the same way the strike on Soleimani upset the apple cart and pushed back against Iran. The fact that we flew American aircraft over Iran and took out a significant piece of their nuclear structure is material. I wish we would have continued that effort and taken the program back significantly and given the Iranian people even more opportunity for a better outcome for themselves as well. But I give him an A+, but he needs to do extra credit.
Secretary Clinton.
Well, I think that where we are right now is we're in a wait and see period. The 20-point plan lays out a pathway toward disarming Hamas. How that will actually be accomplished is going to take a lot of attention, because it is clear that from what we've seen, Hamas has very little interest in giving up its weapons and decommissioning its arsenal, and that they do remain a source of real intimidation and attacks on the Palestinian people as they are attempting to return to their previous homes. So Hamas remains a difficult conundrum. But the 20-point plan, which builds on a lot of prior efforts, but which had, I think, been only possible because Iran was not just bombed by the United States, which I did agree with and thought was important to do, but because its proxies, particularly Hezbollah, had been so degraded. Hamas was obviously under relentless attack. I think there's a debate going on inside Iran, but I will certainly not be surprised if Iran is moving quickly, do everything they can to reconstitute their nuclear program, to try to bring Hezbollah back from the damage that had been done by the Israeli attacks on them. And I would imagine that they're looking for ways to try to maintain some support for Hamas. So what does that mean? It means that the United States must, with its partners, first and foremost Israel, but also Egypt, Jordan, the Gulf, I would argue even the Europeans, who have a role to play with reforming the Palestinian Authority, have to stay incredibly focused on next steps, because there is a plan, very primitive, rudimentary in the 20-point plan, but it does incorporate a lot of the prior thinking about what is workable, what has to be attempted. So I'm hoping that the President Trump remains focused. And I would only add this, these kinds of commitments by an American president, any American president, have to be backed up by teams of people who are on the ground, who are working with the Israelis. I mentioned you've got to have some Palestinian presence that is not Hamas. And, right now, that's either creating something from scratch, a so-called technocratic government, or trying to force change on the Palestinian Authority, which at least has a level of legitimacy with the Palestinian people and the larger community. So you've got to stay focused, and you need a lot of people working on that. And the way that this president does diplomacy, and Karen and I talk about this in the class, is extremely personal. It's very, and it's with a very few people that he uses to convey his opinions. That might work to get to the ceasefire, and that might work to, bring the hostages home, because those are very focused, intense efforts. But then the real difficulty begins about how do you translate that into something more lasting. So I'm hoping that the president's attention stays focused, that the 20-point plan has some meat on the bone, and that they're looking at how they can actually begin to move toward the phase 2 and move from there. And then you got to keep your eye always on Iran. They are unreconstructed. They have no interest in being a good actor within the region. And I think that if we can, stay focused and determined, maybe something positive will come out of it.
So I think we're at time, and we could spend hours. And the good news for the students in the room is that you are really incredibly lucky that you have these two to continue this conversation. So let me just really very briefly, 30 seconds, for the students in the room, what advice you would give them about should they think about decision-making, policy-making in this area, how to balance the courage, the clarity of mind that is needed with courage amidst uncertainty, especially at this moment. So very quickly, to you, Secretary Pompeo, and then to you, Secretary Clinton.
Oh, goodness. I don't know how to do that in 30 seconds. I'll give you what I tried to think about every day when I was in those two incredible roles where I was so privileged to try and serve America. And I got a lot wrong during my time. It was always try and separate the signal for the noise and remember why the heck you're doing what you're doing. Back to foundational ideas. What is it that we're really trying to accomplish? How are we trying to do that? The Washington Post is going to write its thing. The New York Times will write its piece. Fox News will have its theory of the case. Like, what is it, Mike, that you believe that President Trump is asking you to do on behalf of America? If you can do that, whatever role you find yourself in, whether you're a consular affairs officer at the State Department or a brand new analyst at the CIA or wherever you find yourself, just remember there's a mission, there's a reason you took on the role that you did. If you get up every morning, put your helmet on, get out and get after it again for one more day to try and accomplish that, I think you can find an enormous amount of success. And if we all collectively do that, I'm pretty convinced America's going to get another 250 great years. And it's great to be with you all today because it encourages me. I'm heartened, and I think it's even more likely than I did when I came in the room today.
Secretary Clinton.
Well, you can take our classes. I think it's really important to, number one, work to learn what you believe. What are your values? And it's not about any one president. It is about, in the case of the United States, and we have students literally from all over the world, it is about both the values, the ideals, the institutions of your country. In our country, it is about the Constitution, because that has kept us going for these 250 years through a lot of challenges. Presidents come and go, or at least I hope they come and go, and we have to stay focused on the importance of those founding ideals, what we the people means, what a more perfect union means, and how we understand our role as a citizen, as a leader, or in any specific role. Secondly, and this is a pet peeve of mine, do not get all your news from social media. I don't know what else to say. Please expand your horizon. Read from many different sources, many different points of view, but know what you are reading, as opposed to, in effect, being influenced without really knowing what the source might be. Because we are living in many of the other conflicts that we didn't even get to, a disinformation conflict. People are trying to influence citizens. They're trying to influence, journalists. They're trying to influence leaders. So if you're going to be any one of those, you have to find information that, to the best of your ability, provides some accurate assessment. And then I guess, finally, it's exciting and daunting to be at a time in history where so much is changing. And it is difficult to predict. We started by saying we couldn't have predicted 10 or 15 years ago all that has happened since. But there are certain values that should be respected and serve as your North Star, regardless of the changes that are happening. If somebody is against the rule of law, I don't care who they are, I don't care what country they're in, if they are trying to put their thumb on the scale of how the law works, you cannot support that. I don't care where in the world you are, but if people are being mistreated and abused because of who they are or what they stand for or their beliefs or their religion, you cannot support that, even if you're in the majority and you don't think you have anything in common with them. We have got to get over this idea that there are us and them, because that is fuel for people to manipulate all of us. So I think your time here at Columbia and the opportunity you have not just to study and learn, but to interact with people different from you, from different places, different ideas, different experiences. Mike and I have very different, backgrounds, very different experiences. You've got to come to grips with how we have to live in a world filled with difference while we chart our way in keeping with our values. And in this country, the hope that we can continue to, grow and evolve in keeping with those values. So that's what I would wish for.
Thank you. It's really meaningful to have you both. Thank you so much for everything that you do. All right. Thank you. We're going to teach now. We have a class.